All right, great. Well, thanks. Thanks, Joe. Thanks everybody on the team. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Katie. Thanks everybody. When Katie approached me about this a couple of weeks ago, I was like, well, can you kind of talk about, the events that happened here a couple of years ago, and then kind of fit it in with Super Bowl and special events. And I tried, but it's like going between Star Wars and The Purge. It's like the spectrum is so great between what we went through with some of the events last year, and then kind of the more, say, sort of big deal, but kind of more routinely big deal stuff like Super Bowl, which is like, wow, Super Bowl was a big deal, but then holy moly, the stuff we went through was quite expanded out a little bit. So I will cut off my video here if I can. Oh, there it is up there, just for bandwidth. Okay, so yeah, so everything that's on that picture is all story. It's all stuff that we saw. It was nuts. So for background, RTMC, Regional Transportation Management Center, is in Roseville, just north of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Joint dispatch facility for State Patrol, MnDOT maintenance, and then MnDOT freeway operations. And State Patrol is part of DPS, so it's a separate state agency, unlike some other states. There's DOT and DPS. One big room, all about open sharing of information, no walls, no barriers. The dispatch floor takes up a good part of the building. I mean, that's what most of the building was designed for, was for that dispatch floor. We've been in here 20 years, and it's all state workers, no contracted staff. So our TMC is highly focused, not our, O-U-R-E, our TMC is highly focused on real-time incident management. That's really what we do here as a primary thing. That's what the dispatchers behind me are doing. And really, it's been focused historically on the metro area, Minneapolis and St. Paul metro, and then expanded a little bit more outstate more recently. But it's about trying to find every incident, anything that's going on the freeway, crash, stall, fire, debris, find it on camera. I mean, typically 20 seconds, get it on camera and start triaging it. Is the location correct? Put up the message board, send the service patrol, and then just kind of that working on the little stuff and then scaling up to the big stuff. But really the concentration on the little stuff, the goal to try to get things found, get them cleared a few minutes quicker, and then you multiply that by 50, 100 events a day, and then that's where you get some benefit. We monitor State Patrol's audio, and we're also on State Patrol's CAD system. We use State Patrol's CAD, and the Service Patrol First is also set up. We use State Patrol's events, and we record our benchmarks in there, at least for the traffic related events. So background for Minnesota, in the 90s, there was a very vigorous, very strong TIM steering committee here. There was a principal engineer, a grad engineer, and a 50-50 worker. 50% doing ops, 50% doing TIM stuff. That's the position I was hired for back in 2002, was as that 50% busy bee. All of that got lost in the early 2000s. The aftermath of the 9/11 economic crunch, combined with some political stuff, combined with some other stuff, budget cuts, freezes, attrition. That principal, she got promoted, she went up, and we couldn't refill. That spot was left open for a year, and then it disappeared, and don't even have it anymore. Same thing happened to the grad engineer position. That one also disappeared. Now on the plus side, that grad engineer is now our office director, so that's pretty cool. So he has a long history and a lot of experience on the TIM part of it in this day-to-day kind of TIM focused TMC. But the actual dedicated positions went away. And then basically because of we had other losses in the ops center, really the focus became, as we had the opportunity, as I got promoted and replacing my old spot, and as other people here left, never could add positions, but it was about retooling, reclassifying positions as they opened up to really focus them as this real-time TIM dispatch part of it. So we have not had a background staff to do TIM things in 20 years. Responder training has been the Minnesota version, which traditionally has been agency specific. So, such and such fire department, such and such police department, typically 2 hours, no advertising. It's all just word of mouth. And it's basically me and a couple of other folks as we have the opportunity to do it, but because there's no background staff to support anything more. On the plus side, all of that work in the 90s and the early 2000s really helped, I think, and then some consistency on our side and changes on the other groups have really helped with good relationships and good understanding of who does what. So when there's problems, they can usually be addressed on the floor between the supervisors for the most part. Finally, we do now have a full-time TIM person starting, and this was another one that was froze for 2 years because of COVID hiring restrictions, but he'll be starting next month. So that's good. So at least we have a full-time person focused on TIM starting next month. And then there's also a consultant that's been hired by the DPS, and a different part of DPS and State Patrol Office Traffic Safety, but they are also assisting on formulating some TIM direction. So so I think there's some progress on the bigger part of it here, but it's been a long time. Something else for background on Minnesota, and this kind of came out of listening to other presentations over the years. So Minnesota, we don't have hurricanes, right? We have tornadoes, we have, you have flooding, but it's localized. It's not like the entire state or like the entire region of multi-states is going to have to be evacuated or again get hit by a hurricane. I mean, we don't deal with that here, fortunately. We have fires, we have grass fires, but it's not fires where cities have to be evacuated or towns get swallowed up with the people in them and they become mass fatalities, at least not in 120 years in Minnesota. And it's cold. It's Minnesota. It gets cold in the wintertime. We get snow. We get 6, 8 inches, 10 inches. Yeah, it's a big deal. It takes a couple of days. It's not a crisis. It's not like we're getting 3, 4 feet of snow at a time like some other parts do. So really, some Minnesota's statewide emergency ops, so the state's emergency operations part is pretty modest. I mean, really modest compared to what I've seen in other states as far as the ability to put people together from a state level and having the state organize things. It's really a lot of stuff in Minnesota is a lot more local focused and then kind of expands from that. Okay, so civil disturbances. Civil disturbances are people. The pictures on the bottom are the same location. That's 35W in the Mississippi River. The picture on the bottom left is the bridge collapse, which the 15th anniversary is next week. Strictly from a TIM perspective, that was pretty basic. The road's closed. Nobody's going through. We're going to shut it down. It's pretty basic. I mean, beyond everything else that was going on with the bridge collapse, just strictly from a TIM position, it was shut it down. It was pretty simple. The one on the right is 10,000 people. It's at least 2 different marches that came together on the Sunday, the week after George Floyd was murdered, and just assembled on the Mississippi River Bridge. And 80%, 90% of these people are, just there to protest. They're there, because it's a thing to be doing. The problem is that 1 or 2 or maybe 3% of the folks in here are actively have active agendas to do a lot more and a lot more damage and to cause things to happen. And it's both far left, but also far right as well. And then you figure, and 1 or 2% out of 100 people, okay, that's one person, but 1 or 2% out of 10,000 people, that's 100, that's 200 people who are hardcore focused on wrecking things or worse. And then you figure another 10% of this group that's going to follow along and is going to kind of be stirred up. So you've got a serious situation here where, how do you shut this down? How close do you want your people to be to shut this down, to shut this traffic down where they're not in harm and where their equipment can't be taken and used for very bad things, which was a real concern. And then you throw into this, just on a general level, the opportunists, the looting, the arson, stuff like that. So that is really the hard part with civil disturbances. You actively have people trying to sabotage and do potentially really bad stuff with your things, and how do you deal with it? And what if you don't have any cops? What if you don't have any law enforcement? Not for hours, but for days and for weeks. There is no law enforcement presence. If your folks are out there and something happens and they ask for help, Nobody's going to come get them because there's nobody to come and get them. You had massive crowds, you had violent elements within these crowds, you had a variety of different motivations. Again, majority of it peaceful, majority of it civil disobedience, but still enough within these crowds that you had legitimate concerns. And then the fact that you'd have 2,000 people just appear at one end and another 2,000 people appear over here, and trying to keep track of even where these groups are going to come from and just their sheer size. So then that kind of circles around. The problem is, well, what do you do? Well, so how do you shut it down? Well, there's no safe way to shut it down. We don't have any help. We can't do it. We can't shut it down. But when the fuel tanker drives through this crowd of 10,000 people, if one person in this crowd had died, if 10 people in this crowd had died, if 100 people in this crowd had died, me saying we did the best that we could wouldn't have mattered. I mean, that would not have stood up. So, even so, I mean, don't, if you're ever in this position, keep trying to think of things that you can do, and I'll come up with that in the next slide. But it just don't get to a point where it gets normalized, where boy, you're really stuck and you keep thinking, and you may still be stuck, but just keeping in the back of your head that as stuck as you are, it's not going to make any difference if things go really bad, because that's not going to hold up in court, and it's not going to hold up in the public. So, which is a scary spot to be. All right, so some of the stuff that we came up with, getting to do this all over again was some preparation for the trial, for Officer Chauvin's trial, and keeping in mind, I mean, the chances of a cop being convicted for something's pretty low. So we were heavily expecting that this was all going to happen again a year later. So this was something that we came up with: hot, warm, cold zones, and this comes out of fire and out of hazmat. But this was a way to articulate to the service patrol and to the service patrol dispatchers, and to an extent with our own maintenance folks, on how to set up and where to set up safely. So cold, no reasonable expectation. I mean, some could still happen, but no reasonable expectation that you're going to encounter a group of people. Warm is, there's something a block away, maybe a couple of blocks away. But if you're paying attention, and combination of you paying attention and overwatch from TMC, you have a reasonable amount of time where you put your cones out, you get everything ready to go, and you keep your eyes open. And if overwatch says you need to get out of there, then you can get out of there safely. And a lot of this was for shutting down ramps and stuff like that, just in case, just as a strategy. And then hot is basically you're too close. I mean, you're going to be overrun. And even within that overrun scenario, being reasonable and being thoughtful and being self-educated on the command level or on the DOT command level of not panicking either, and not creating a situation where you're giving orders, or your folks who are out there, they may have a group of people around them, but making sure that they know the difference between, this is one where you really need to get out of there, or you leave your truck, versus, you know what, this is fine, just let them go by. This is a totally different group, and it may look scary, but it's a totally different group, and really don't think we're going to have a problem. So that gets into some amount of detail there, but so some of the other things that came out of all this, and again, this is completely insane. This is stuff I never would have thought we would be thinking about. But you can't have type 3s in the hot or warm zone. They get disassembled, they get turned into weapons. The poles get thrown at officers, they get smashed, they smash through windows. The metal slats get thrown, the sandbags get dropped off of bridges on the traffic. You can't have type 3s anywhere near where any of these groups are coming through. Cones are useless. They get picked up, they get thrown around, they put them on their head. Barrels are better, but then this was something that we learned 10 years before out of the RNC, the Republican National Convention, and I think that was from this came out of Seattle from '99 in the World Trade Organization. Is that there was a guy came up from Texas, I think, before the RNC, and was stealing barrels, cutting them in half, painting them black, and basically making them into shields, so that then the protesters or rioters could use these as shields against the law enforcement 40 millimeter. And it's one thing too, if this is just, a standoff in the middle of the street with, cops shooting, cops shooting 40 millimeter at a group of people in the street. What we saw last year was, again, another borrowed strategy from this case, Hong Kong, of the protesters using umbrellas to block tear gas, block 40 millimeter, and then lining themselves up next to the fence around this police station, with the intent of then cutting a hole in the fence, opening the fence up, and then rushing in on this police station to take the police station over. So this is how serious this stuff can be. So what we did for the Chauvin trial, we identified basically 30-something ramps that were in the hot zone, they're in the warm zone, and we pre-deployed Triton barriers. I know there's some other commercial names for them, but basically the big hollow plastic J barriers that you fill full of water as a ballast. So these were pre-staged in the grass, and the intent was, hey, if the officer gets acquitted, combination with a curfew being called, crew would go out in daylight hours. As soon as that curfew was called, they'd start dragging these barriers across, filling them up, and then getting out of there. And at least it was something. At least we would have something. We would make some attempt to try to shut down some of these areas in the hot zone, not have any personnel nearby. At least it was something. And that came out of, again, that incident with the fuel tanker on the bridge. So, going back then, going back in time to 2008 in the RNC, some lessons that were learned on our side. And this is me as a dispatcher, and then trying to carry this forward as when I became a supervisor. We already had a good process, a good way of shutting freeways down based off of what we saw, based off of the service patrol. So don't complicate that. If you have a good process that works, don't complicate it, make it scalable, but don't add extra steps into it for the dispatchers. Traffic control is traffic control mostly. Again, don't complicate it. Having good intelligence on the floor is important. Listening to the audio, listening as close as you can be to those initial reports to be able to say, yeah, here's what's going on, to be at the forefront, not in the background. And then the supervisors are the ones who can be there to step in and say, hey, we're doing things a little bit differently this time, or have them do this instead. They're also the firewall between, whether it's the public or whether it's management wanting to find out what's going on. They're talking to the supervisors. They're not talking to the dispatchers themselves. And then something else was, as much as possible, not having management on the ops floor. Unless they are willing to answer a question. If there's something happened, there's some crisis just arrived, that management person better be able to say, yes, do this, no, don't do that. Because that was another problem that we saw that came up. It just added to the confusion of having bosses floating around who couldn't answer questions. And then something, getting back, scaling back down to the Super Bowl and Final Four. A lot of benefit when you get the opportunity to talk to other states who've done it. That was a huge help for us talking to Arizona. Even though a lot of things didn't, entirely pan out the same way, it was still helpful because we had so little information about what to expect. It was really helpful getting some of that information from them. And then what we did for the MAC, the Multi-Agency Command Center, and there's different ways to approach this. For us on the TMC level, it was basically taking what we do here at the RTMC and making it a one-person thing and having that at the MAC. So instead of having, and there's still a maintenance person from MnDOT in the MAC who could be asked questions, but the TMC role was same thing that we do here. You're listening to the radio, you're listening to patrol audio, you're listening to the FSP dispatch. Scanner was nice to hear some of the TAC channels, you got access to the cameras, and it's about situational awareness. It's about knowing, hey, here's this thing that's coming up right now, probably before everybody else in the room even knows about it. You hear about it, you found it, you got it up on camera, and then when somebody asks, you can say, oh yeah, it's up there in the top left. Or, hey, by the way, this thing's coming, so heads up. And that was also something that even before the Super Bowl, we were asked to set up some sort of a role at the new stadium, the new US Bank Stadium. And this was the thought, after some thinking, this was the thought of what we would do, is basically a one-person TMC focused again on the situational awareness. And that's the value that we can provide on a command level and the value that we can convey to others, that situational awareness. So overall, you know, between all of these things, especially with the riots and everything, I mean, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, for sure, it was extremely stressful. We made it through. You know, there's the ongoing issues of camera zooming and, you know, making sure that the MnDOT cameras are in the gray area and not being targeted themselves by protest groups, and being very careful about the law enforcement use. Even just, you know, and then a lot of stuff with the DOT, just basic stuff like when maintenance is going out to shut something down, say, hey, can you have your guys go 1,000 feet up? Don't shut it down at the dog leg, shut it down at the clover leaf. And then now people have two ways that they can go to be detoured. So that was very worked out pretty well. That ability to coordinate between the on an individual level, and then some of the individual troopers that were up here. So those were all pluses as well. And again, the scale of this was so nuts, and so it blew up so quickly. Really hard to deal with it on the fly. I guess the one other point that I'd put in there, I mean, if it happened here, I mean, there's certainly uniquenesses here to Minnesota, but if it happened here, it could happen most anywhere else. So it's a hard one to plan for, but hopefully nobody else has to deal with it. So that's my rant. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time.